We're on. Kia ora koutou katoa. It's awesome to welcome you to another RaC Guild Townhall, and this is number 12. We've been going for a year. It's exciting to be at this point and see that the momentum has continued, and there is growing interest in rules as code in lots of areas of the world. If you're watching this in the recording, welcome. Do get involved in our Slack channel and participate in the rules as code community, and there's lots of ways you can do that. This is a great privilege for us to have Pia with us today, who's going to be presenting some thoughts on the transformational power of rules as code as we're in this really uncertain world right now. Rules are some of the things that are holding us together, along with empathy and kindness and lots of other things, I hope. And Pia's going to give us a presentation today of that transformational power. But I just want to highlight for everybody that this is the first birthday of the RaC Guild. RaC Guild would not have been here if it hadn't been for a project that we started back in, I think we first started talking about it in 2021. It was just off the back end of COVID, wasn't it, that we started talking about it, and then got some funding from the Cardano community to do a project and do a reference project of rules as code, and then start to build this community, because rules as code is an important part of the infrastructure that we need to operate our world, and all the countries talk to each other from all aspects, not just from the policy end. But Pia is known as the government reformer and has a lot to say about where the rules sit and the power of them. So I will stop waffling. There will be time for questions afterwards. We will make time for questions afterwards. Handing over to you, Pia. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Kia ora, and thank you so much for having me, everyone. It's a real delight to join the town hall today. I am going to use some slides. I'm very sorry for that, but I do find that it is kind of helpful. I'm going to be moving through a lot of content, but just before I start, I think it's probably just worth saying that I've been on this journey of rules as code for 10 years now, and it's really interesting, particularly in this crowd, to sort of reflect on the evolution of that journey. And so just before I jump in, I just want to quickly talk about this because I think it's helpful context. I started when I was working in a regulator. I was working in a financial regulator in Australia, and I remember looking at how the organization works and how a regulator works, and being absolutely fascinated by the idea that you've got this entity that sets rules, and then these regulated entities need to find and apply these rules, and how does that work? And what I found was that the connection point between the making of the rules and the consuming of the rules was huge. Was completely broken. The gap between those processes was huge, and the mutual incomprehension was fascinating. And so we started exploring the idea of, well, what would happen if we made some of these rules available, the prescriptive rules available, as a utility that the regulated entities, tens of thousands of them in some cases, could just consume. And we had banks tell us, if you could just make the prescriptive rules available as an API, that would save us millions of dollars a year, every year. And then the process of actually trying to change those, changing rules into code is not hard. It's done by business professionals and software developers around the world every day. But the idea of making a version that could be an authoritative version that everyone could consume was fascinating. And reading that particular regulation was appalling, was awful. And I remember talking to the actual drafter and saying, why? How did you create these rules that have triple negatives over the course of, one clause over 10 pages? And I remember this guy having this epiphany, and we built some trust with him, and he looked at me and he said, I just had a really bad year that year. And this realization that so many rules that then affect the lives of many people can just be written on a bad day, you know? And so when I got to New Zealand and we had the wonderful opportunity to not just explore rules as code as a concept of transcoding as a public utility, but how might we draft better rules? How might we bring all of the techniques of test-driven drafting, of you know, being able to inform an approach to writing better rules in the first place? That second epiphany was key. And I think a lot of people lose that. A lot of people just think, yeah, we'll write the rules and then we'll make it available as code and easy. But the opportunity here is actually to write better rules in the first place. So I'm going to go through where my thinking has got to at this point. Of course, it will continue to evolve. But for me, rules as code now is not the main game, but it is a key and foundational enabler to my main game. My main game at the moment is trying to transform public sector, trying to transform how policy is developed and implemented and iterated over time, and how governments should be run in a way that is constantly optimizing for responding to changing needs, responding to new opportunities and threats, but primarily being a foundation upon which people can actually thrive, which means they need to be able to iterate and improve their effectiveness, their efficacy, not just their efficiency. And unfortunately, a lot of the governments that I've worked in, there's been such a focus on efficiency for the sake of efficiency that they've kind of lost the point of their purpose. So this is getting back to how to have purpose-driven and mission-oriented public sectors, for which rules as code is part of it. So excuse me going through some slides. I am going to move through them fairly quick because I do want to have a lot of time for chat. And there's really just three main key points I'm going through, but just in some detail. So it's not just about digital rules, it's about digital drafting for a digital economy. And the goal is to get better impact, better consistency, compliance, and access to justice in an increasingly unpredictable world. I do want to remind everyone, I do say this all the time, but I think it's always worth repeating, that we invented all of this. So sometimes it feels so hard and so big to make change because the systems or the structures or the culture or the processes that we come up against feel so embedded. But the fact is that all of those systems and processes and cultures were developed by people just like us, no different to us. And if we invented this as a people, then we can reinvent it. And the key thing is that if we don't, then who will? We can't just sit around waiting for someone else to make change for us. We need to step in and realize that these are all just interchangeable parts, and we can construct the parts in different ways to get a better outcome. And of course, the best way to predict the future is to invent it, which we always like to talk about. So let's make a start with the current problem. Government services, the way that government service delivery tends to work in theory, is that someone has a bright idea, they create the legislation and the authority for, you know, a particular service or a social benefit or a, you know, taxation. That's then drafted into rules, and then that goes into systems that the service is delivered. But the reality, of course, is much more messy. There's lots and lots and lots of different rules, official ones, unofficial ones, and they all get sort of mashed together into systems used by governments to deliver services. The same with regulated entities. The theory, you know, someone has a bright idea, goes in regulation, and then there's lots and lots and lots of, everyone is interpreting it in their own way, and everyone's building into their own business systems in individual ways. Complete inconsistency is then complicated by the fact that there's internal rules, there's multiple different regulatory domains, and the actual impact of those regulations are very rarely effectively measured. People are more measuring the level of compliance than the level of intended impact, or indeed unintended impacts of new rules or regulations or legislation. So a lot of the drafting process is guest driven. Here's what we did before, so let's do that. Or here's what some other country is doing, so let's do that. And not necessarily test driven, because, you know, you actually need to try a rule to know it's going to have the impact that you expect it's going to have, where, you know, they're sort of going, well, here's our best possible guess. Very inefficient, of course, because everyone's having to interpret themselves and build it into their own business systems individually. Inconsistently applied, of course. ineffective in terms of the intended impact, which is not particularly well measured, but also very opaque. How is that ledge being interpreted? Is the interpretation correct? And we did find this in New Zealand with the Better Rules program years ago that we did when we looked at the Holidays Act. Everyone's interpretation of what a working week was different, which led to different rates of pay and different and mispayments across the entire nation, the entire economy, because everyone had the different interpretation of one particular critical variable. But there is a new consideration as well, which is that how we shape, and that is what regulation and legislation is meant to do. Regulation is just how we shape behaviours in the broader economy. Legislation is how we shape the behaviours of public institutions. They're both a form of regulation. But shaping society and the economy is no longer just about shaping human behaviour, because machines, bots, AI, automation, doesn't respond to legal, financial, or criminal levers. So rule-makers actually need to consider machines as users as part of how we do the drafting of rules. Because the idea, each one of these, by the way, is a completely generated person with facials, with pictures and backgrounds and backstories. Each one of these is a bot, which is kind of terrifying. If we don't, when we're building our regulation and legislation today, consider the way that a machine might interpret and apply it, noting, of course, that they're not going to be scared of punishment, because the concept of being scared is a human thing, not a machine thing, then we might start building rules that actually drive some very perverse outcomes, which is why actually simulating the impact of rules is absolutely key. A test-driven approach to rules is absolutely key. So the three questions I guess I have for today, and the questions that I ask myself regularly at the moment, is how do we ensure effective, efficient, and traceable adoption of LegReg in a digital economy? How do we design and continuously improve a test-driven leg and regs that are fit for purpose in the digital age and that actually drive intended outcomes? And of course, with the rise of artificial intelligence in all of its different forms, but particularly the massive adoption of machine learning-based systems, how do we build trustworthy systems, trustworthy outcomes, trustworthy decisions as we enter this very strange period? So let's run through them. To build efficient, effective, and traceable adoption, if we start looking at the idea of genuinely having an api.legislation.gov.xx.au.t.nz, etc., not only can you actually have a similar adoption, everyone's actually adopting the same interpretation rather than their own interpretations, you can actually then start to monitor the rules themselves. You can see how many people have hit a particular part of the regulation. You can identify that a particular exemption hasn't had a single call to it. Why is that? We expected at least 10% of regulated entities to need to use that exemption. Why is no one even hitting that part of the API? You can start to monitor for the utilization, for the lack of utilization, and start to do, A/B testing of different potential outcomes. And you can actually provide not just the regulation, but a test suite. So I've come to the realization that rules as code is not sufficient. We also need to provide rules test suites, which basically says, well, here's, 50 or 100 or 1 million, automatically generated if you need to, but scenarios that this scenario should result in this output, should result in this result of the application of the rules. And if you, when you publish your rule set, can also publish a machine-readable test suite, that gives people consuming your rules the ability to constantly be testing their systems against the test suite to make sure that the outputs are consistent with the expected performance of the rules. So the consistency here gets in not just the adoption of a consistent interpretation, a trusted interpretation, but also in the ability to test your systems against not just the rules, but test suite built around the rules, which of course then gives you a great way to get policymakers and drafters involved in building out the test suite. And it also means that if down the track they want to make changes to the rules themselves, you can test those changes against their intended outcomes and say, well, hold on, that change accidentally has this different impact than you're expecting on this part of your test suite. I think this group knows better than most people about which sort of rules, so I won't go into this too much, but obviously prescriptive rules is key, and precedent after it merges. I'm not a big believer in codifying principles-based rules, because it is important to maintain not just the human accountability for decision-making where judgment is applied, but it is important to not outsource that judgment to a machine. It is useful to monitor for how humans that apply their judgment. You know, we can look for bias in sentencing or look for bias in decisions from people, but at the same time, we do need to have in principles-based rules the ability for people to apply changing public values over time. I won't go too much into this because this group knows it fairly well, but rules as code is obviously complemented by test suites and infrastructure to support the whole policy journey. I'm going to be going into that in a little bit. So I think the other point here is that the entire world, particularly in the West, particularly Western countries, really went down the let's get away from prescriptive rules and get to principles-based rules. But what's happened over the last 20 years is that the dramatic shift of principles-based regulation and principles-based legislation, people started, like, which sounded like a great idea, has turned out to be very expensive, very slow, very complex, and it means that the entire risk of assumptions is on the consumer of the rules, the people who have to apply the principles. So people have started to realize that actually, where you want consistency, it's helpful to have prescriptive rules. Where you actually want a judgment, it's helpful to have principles. So most regulation will have a combination of both, but the idea that you will only have prescriptive or only have principles takes you too far away from what should be a fairly balanced approach. It shouldn't be about ideology, it should be about pragmatism. And pragmatism is where you want consistency, you need prescriptive rules. Where you want judgment used, you need principles. So how might we design and continuously improve? This is where it gets a bit more interesting for me. If the current set of rules is that everyone just does their own, you end up with myriad squared people interfacing with rules through myriad systems that the rules were added to. You have very limited reuse, conflicting interpretations, and there's no ability to assure tens of thousands of organizations how they all adopted your rules, right? So you end up doing spot checks, you end up doing self-reporting, you end up doing all of these mechanisms that will only ever scratch the surface of the domain, meaning that you can only truly assure, you know, maybe 20% of the domain, maybe 10%, maybe 2%. So then you start spending all your money on figuring out which 2% that you should assure, rather than actually having a minimum viable assurance of the entire sector. Making better rules, of course, starting with your model, having a draft-driven approach, not just to your rules, but to your test suite and to a reference implementation, being able to enact the human-readable version, but making a human-readable version, machine-readable version, and a test suite publicly available means that everyone can consume the same rules, and then you can monitor. So the better rules methodology is not just about you know, applying modern methods like your design methods, your human-centered design, your agile, etc. It's actually about the isomorphic drafting of rules. So drafting human and machine-readable rules at the same time, literally sitting side by side so that they can be testing with each other. When you said this, did you mean this? When I think I want this to be consistently applied, how might we do that? I'm going to just skip forward a little bit, but there is a key point here that we do need to collectively draw a line in the sand at some point. I have been saying this for years, and it is frustrating that this line hasn't been drawn yet. But until we actually draw a line where all new regs, all new leg is drafted in a test-driven way, we're going to continue this current thing that we have of constantly having to chase the process of guest-driven, inefficiently driven drafted rules. And there is a whole science and long history of trying to do the best possible drafting possible. So I'm not at all saying that drafters don't do the best job that they can, but until we incorporate some of these test-driven approaches, then and machine-readable version approaches, we're going to continue to build rules that we don't know if they're going to be entirely effective until they get implemented, which is way down the track, and it's usually too late to then do much about it. So let's come back to the trustworthy systems, and then I better stop. So for me, part of where my thinking has evolved is that rules as code can actually provide a guardrail, a technical guardrail for AI systems, whether they're machine learning or not, because machine learning systems do not follow rules. So this is a really simple example. I do have other examples where they had a ChatGPT versus a traditional rules-based chess engine. And ChatGPT, of course, just started just made stuff up. Generative AI doesn't follow rules. It mimics stuff. It synthesizes patterns. It looks for patterns and then provides a projection of a pattern. But of course, it doesn't test any of those outputs or those projections against anything except against training data. So it's just looking for patterns. And of course, that means it's going to get things wrong constantly in a rules-based system. So one of the opportunities we could have might be things like, if there is a Gen AI tool, what if you had rules as code? So you had in this case, a chess game rules. Gen AI might hallucinate, a million different potential moves, but being able to then funnel those moves and test them against the rules, in this case, the rules of chess, the rules of what's legal for different moves to work. But of course, in the real world, it could be against legislation or regulation or law before taking an action. There is an argument to say that we could all use a bit more hallucination every so often, but we do need to be able to funnel those potential moves against what is allowed, what is lawful, what is within the rules before we take any action. So there are some useful ways that could work. Decision-making systems need guardrails. Of course, a lot of people are playing around with machine learning for decision-making. From a government perspective, I have a very firm position on this. And I'll just say it's not necessarily one that's shared by everyone, but my position is that we should not be using machine learning for any administrative decisions in government for two reasons. Because machine learning, of course, produces inconsistency of how a rule is applied. 10 people with the same 10 conditions over the course of time are going to get potentially 10 different outcomes from a machine learning based system, because of course the system itself is learning over time. So it therefore conflicts with the rule of law. But the other part, of course, is administrative law, which basically says that you should be able to explain under what authority and which rules you applied to make a decision. And machine learning, of course, doesn't apply rules per se. So rules-based decision-making is better. So rules-based automation, rules-based is not necessarily a bad thing if, so automation isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's rules-based, so long as you can demonstrate how the decision was made, have the traceability back to and provenance back to which parts of the law were applied, and the explainability of how this was applied. Now, of course, the way that explainability as a term has been sort of co-opted into being explaining that you're interacting with an AI, or explaining that how the training data uses, of course, doesn't pass any sniff test. If a decision is made about you from government, it needs to be explainable in the true sense of the word, that you need to be able to show you're working and under what rules you've and authorities that you've had to make that decision. So I don't think machine learning should be used for automated decision-making. It can inform risk assessment, it can inform data, but it should not be used to make the actual decision unless it can be properly explainable, because lawfulness requires testing against, being able to consume legislation as code and being able to test against that legislation if a system is based on rules. Efficiency arguably requires being able to consume regulation as code, so that you're not having to constantly get into that hamster wheel of interpretation, and being able to test against the regulation, so that you're constantly minimizing the risk that you've got the interpretation wrong or that your system's not working right. And fairness of government systems requires not just measuring for policy impact, but measuring for human impact and being able to actively monitor for and mitigate harm. So I've got a bunch around AI signage and guardrails. Basically, signage is anything that helps you regulate your own behavior, and guardrail is something that actually stops the car going off the cliff. So there's some information about that, which I won't get into too much, but the key point here is that from a technical guardrails perspective, you can see that a lot of this would require rules as code. You want to be able to have provenance of rules, you want to be able to test against rules, you want to be able to ensure the lawfulness, operation of and implementation of not just laws, but also policies. And there are some real opportunities for rules as code to be part of the AI architecture stack in order to keep it in check. So I'm just going to finish on one quick point about policy infrastructure. So where I've got to, getting away from AI entirely for a second, is that public institutions, closing that gap between policy design and delivery, you can see has a very close corollary to closing the gap between legislative and regulatory design and delivery. Being able to get more iterative, more experimentation-based, test-driven, being able to manage a policy position end-to-end, which might involve ledger or reg, or it might just involve other policy interventions. But whatever you use to try to drive a policy outcome, owning that process end-to-end means actually having shared policy infrastructure. The way that the policies are interpreted, modeled, monitored, escalated, managed, delivered, everyone should be working off the same song sheet, not having their own interpretation and then wondering why their understanding differs from other parts of the groups involved in the ultimate delivery of a policy outcome. So imagine if we could actually have a process which was, actually, sorry, I'll jump forward to this one. So the concept of policy infrastructure, of course, requires in the life of a policy, what are all the different tools and data and systems and registers that could possibly help us actually ensure and optimize for and actively, proactively manage the intended outcome of policy. And at least 3 of those, of course, directly require rules as code. We need to have not just the publicly available policy as code, so the ledger reg available as code. We need to have our case law and gazettes available as machine-readable utilities so that we can look backwards and compare case law and precedents. And of course, the policy test suite would be a critical part of any modern rules as code infrastructure. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that's been helpful in thinking. You can see that where I've got to with rules as code is not just rules as code for the sake of rules as code, but as a critical part of ensuring that we can both build better rules, that we can assure and have an effective and efficient implementation and adoption of those rules for better impact, that we can create the guardrails and checks and balances for our systems, including increasingly AI systems, and finally, so that we can actually have effectively a digital twin of policy to be part of our policy infrastructure. I hope that's been helpful. Would love to have a chat.
More than helpful. It's a masterclass, very short, concise masterclass. Thank you very much indeed, Pia. I know there are questions in the room, so I'm going to open the floor immediately without further ado. Who wants to go first? Go for it, Jason.
Hey, Jason. Great to see you.
Nice to see you too, Pia. So I have 2 questions for you. I'll start with what I think is probably the easier one. You were talking about explainability, and there's a distinction that I've seen some people draw between having an explanation that follows the rules and justifies the outcome that came out of an automated system, and having an explanation that is an actual description of the causal reason the system came to that conclusion. So for example, let's say I throw it into an LLM, here are all the facts, and here's the rules, and tell me what the answer should be. And then I take the same facts and I put them into a rules as code system, and then I get back an explanation from the rules as code system as to how you could have reached that, but it's not how it was actually reached. Does that matter?
It does matter. For administrative law, it does matter. It's the irony of all of this is, sorry, I'm just going to give you some levity just briefly, and then I promise I'll answer it properly. The irony of me talking about this is when I was at school, I was very good at math, but I hated showing my working out. And so I got into a war with particularly my year 10 teacher, who I still adore today. But she would say, well, but you could have, you have to show your working out. And I'd say, why? She'd go, well, because you could have cheated. I'm like, literally no one else in the class got it right. So that's dumb. She goes, well, I need to know that you know the process. I'm like, why? If I got the answer right, who just get, anyway, so it got to the point where, and this is just how stubborn I am, I guess, I was more than happy to get all the answers right and lose half the points because I refused to show the working out. But I still passed, so so the irony is that I'm here defending showing your working out, even though I hate it. Administrative law is a general principle in most governments. I wouldn't say all because I don't know it to be all, but it's definitely all governments I've worked in and most governments. If a person is told that they're not eligible for something, they should be able to told why. And that why should be explicit. Because you don't meet this condition, because you are earning too much, or you haven't been in the country long enough, or you have because you don't have children and it's a child benefit. If you don't have the explicit reason that you're saying yes or no, then it's a less trustworthy answer, and it's not meeting that basic principle of the why. You need to be able to demonstrate explicitly why. You can't turn around and say, oh, because we did a training data program and we built it all in, and the example I quite often give to people is the concept of more or less trustworthy use of AI. And I always like to say, rules-based tax, if you get a tax bill, you want to know exactly how that was calculated. You want to know that you could replicate and to the dollar the amount. Whereas if someone said, oh, well, we fed all your data into an LLM and this is the number we gave, you're not going to pay that tax. No one would pay that tax. And yet we sort of seem to have the expectation that we can use LLMs to determine whether a person's eligible for social protection. It's madness how comfortable people seem to be to apply non-explainable decision-making for people who are vulnerable. So explainability, in the true English sense of the word, before people started getting confused or conflated with AI, explainability is being able to genuinely show the explicit reasons you either get something or don't get something, or how it's calculated if it's a calculation. And that means being able to point back to those rules and being able to show that me being able to independently from the person who did the calculation to be able to replicate that result. And if it's not replicable, and this is the funny thing about LLMs, is that same result is not replicable even in the same LLM. If it continues to learn, if it continues to evolve. And I know that there are point-in-time trained LLMs that are going to get repeatability, but they still miss the explainability test, and therefore that doesn't pass the sniff test or even the legal test for administrative law. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That was the easy one. What's the hard one?
That was the easy. Here's the hard one. What would you say to someone who's interested in rules as code and kind of promoting the development and adoption of rules as code tools, but they are reluctant to adopt the larger vision of changing the way that policy is written or changing the way that effects are monitored, because they're worried that that's making perfect the enemy of the good? And they want rules as code to be something that you can adopt just to get better at automating your websites.
For sure. And the simple, that is actually the easier answer. Meet people where they are. There's no point prophesying an ideology to someone. I have in my head my vision of how I see this, but it's just my vision. Everyone's going to have their own vision, and everyone's going to have their own problem space, right? And the fact is, you don't, if someone tells you they're hungry, you don't force a moose down their throat, right? You find out what they need and help them with their problem. We are in the very lucky position of having some tools and expertise and ideas for how to solve problems that are a bit more scalable. I've been amazed how many people are quite comfortable with the idea of rules as a utility. When I say rules as code, of course, it's amazing how often you get into a debate, particularly with lawyers and policymakers. They're like, well, you can't put rules into code. I'm like, you realize all your rules are being put into code all the time. They're like, no. If you put the rules into code, you'd have all these problems. I'm like, okay, here's 20 business systems that are using your rules right now. Like, all the things you just said are already happening. I'm offering you a solution to that. So a lot of people don't know the problem that they have. People don't need to have a big vision, but rules as code can solve a lot of problems in more scalable ways. So talking to people about their problem, you just want a better website? Cool. Here's a way that it's going to make it easier. Every time there's a change to the rules, you're not having to go and redo your spaghetti mess of business analysis. You're actually pulling the rules out, making them a utility to make it actually cheaper and easier for you to roll out changes to the rules on just your one website. So a lot of departments, a lot of organizations adopt rules as code for their own unique purpose, but it is still useful, even when you're helping someone solve their small problem, to have your own idea about the ultimate good in mind, so that even in the small steps that you're taking them in a direction that is forward. That would be my answer to that. Is that helpful, Jason?
It is. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Pia, for the answer. Kurt,
Kurt.
you're next.
Great to see you,
Yeah,
Kurt.
yeah, you too. Thank you. I really love the way that you described where to use rules as code versus legislation. I'm just wondering, like, how are you finding people approaching this at the moment? Because I'm still seeing lots of people either on both ends of the spectrum. AI is scary. It's going to destroy everything. We're never going to use it. AI has to be absolutely everywhere. For me, like even here, you know, we've got people wanting to use AI for every single part of the code development process. And I'm like, if it's a deterministic process, use deterministic code. If it's something like the principles-based stuff in legislation, yeah, I'll use an LLM to give you an interpretation of multiple ways that a principle might be interpreted. But when it's a rule, use something that gives you a rule, not something that will gives you 80% probability of it interpreting the rule the same way. How are you finding people that you're talking to, so legislators or people actually implementing policy, you know, how are they feeling about this? Are people understanding that it's a different tool, so use it in different places, or it's still like polar opposites of people?
AI or rules as code, or both?
So kind of both. So when
Okay.
you're trying to explain,
Yeah,
you're implementing this thing, use
So
rules as code here. You know?
that's why that chessboard is so interesting, because it's something that everyone can understand. But it's also why I use the machine learning versus rules-based tax calculation, because they all think about, a lot of policymakers think about these things in the abstract. But saying to them, would you be happy to pay a tax bill based on a machine learning prediction of how much tax you probably might pay? And everyone's like, well, of course not. I don't want to pay an extra $1 more of tax than I have to. So it needs to be entirely calculated, right? So those two examples of chess and tax are really clear examples where you would hate to play against a game of chess against someone who just didn't follow the rules, and you would hate to pay an extra $1 of tax. So they're examples that speak to people's heart and get it out of the abstract and into the how would you feel about this affecting you. The second thing is okay, so policy. So I've had lots of conversations with policymakers about generative AI in particular, because they have no understanding about machine learning really, or about the use of data science or the science behind properly applied data science. What they know about AI is what they've been playing with, which is ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever, right? And what's happening is this really interesting slow burn existential crisis of policy people in particular, right? Where they're looking at it, they're going, oh, wow, it's producing something just as good as I can produce. And two interesting things are happening there. First of all, they're not quite recognizing the irony that it demonstrates how lack in scientific rigor policy has become in a lot of countries. It really has just become a creative writing exercise of interpreting whatever they think someone else has told them to do. So that, and the lack of self-awareness sometimes can be quite interesting, but it also shows that they don't quite understand what they're looking at, and they don't have the expertise to understand it. So I'll tell you a quick story. I had some public servants, some policymakers in a country, and it wasn't Australia or New Zealand, it was a country that everyone looks to for AI, which is particularly funny. And they were telling me with great joy that they were using AI to create policy, using ChatGPT to write policy. And I had this moment of absolute horror in my heart, but I had to think very quickly in that moment, why does it horrify me, and how do I communicate that to this person in a way that's not judgy? It's not going to it's not going to make them freak out, but it's going to help them understand and engage with why this is horrific. And luckily, I'm pretty quick at this exact kind of translation game. So what I said to them is, look, I want to explain to you in 3 steps why that's a problem. So bear with me. Step 1, a generative AI is not based on, it is just a synthesis engine. It takes whatever you feed and it produces a synthesis. It might be a projection, but it is necessarily based on data it's been fed, which means it's necessarily fed on the past. So it is a synthesis of the past. At best, it's a projection of the past, but it is not even representing what's happening today. It's representing what's already happened. Do we agree? And they're like, oh, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yeah, that makes sense. Then I said, okay, step 2. Policy, by definition, is supposed to articulate a future state which is different from the current state. Do we agree with that? Because if you're just writing down the current state, that's not policy anymore. That's just documentation. Do we agree? And you could see them start to have an oh shit moment. And I said, so step 3. So why would you use a synthesis engine to create a future state which is different from the current state? You will at best simply project the current state forward. You're not producing something new. And they had this moment of, oh yeah, no, we're totally using this tool wrong. So getting people to think about the Gen AI tools as more like a autocorrect on speed, then, you wouldn't trust autocorrect to write, a letter to your loved one. Helping them understand a mental framing for these tools is really important. And when you give them a mental framing, like autocorrect on speed, then you really do still need to have experts in the room. If you can validate the output, great. And only when you give them a mental framework that they can think about it in, then everything else becomes possible. Then you can have the conversation about, you realize every time you're doing a prompt, the environmental impact is 100 times just writing the code in the first place, that kind of stuff, right? So helping people understand a way to think about these tools that isn't just, oh, it does what I do, it is interesting. And the final thing I'll say is that I did have a friend of mine say to me, but here's the thing, because current policy, so many, not all, but so many people in the policy profession now really could just be replaced by ChatGPT, maybe we should just let them do that. And I keep saying, repeating a bad thing with another bad thing is not, like, we should be using this opportunity to shift, to something better. And so having that conversation is worth it, even though it can be, and the other thing is you can't put forward horror, because people make up their mind emotionally before they engage the brain. So if you react in a negative way, even if what they're saying is horrific, the thing they'll remember is how they feel. And then they'll justify how they feel with what they think. So you need to be able to engage people in that respectful, inclusive, how might we all do this better together? And how can I help you be a better person in how you use these tools? Not just feel bad about yourself and then probably rail against whatever it is I'm saying. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, brilliant explanation as always. I will say though, my daughter plays by those chess rules, and it's still fun. So.
Oh, of course, and yeah, chess rules is great. Yeah. My daughter got obsessed with The Witcher. I haven't let her watch it, but she saw me playing it and wanted me to. So I started telling her stories about 2 years ago. Yeah. And of course I ran out of stories at some point, so I tried to use Gen AI to start creating stories, but unfortunately they were nowhere near as good as my stories apparently, so I'm completely stuck. Anyway, sorry, next.
Gorgeous, and a perfect example of kindness and empathy being combined with rules as code and personal stories and the whole piece, making the world a better place. Alfred, you've got your hand up.
Yes, let me just lower it now. Cool. So, well, firstly, fun fact, my 10-year-old son is the stubborn young year 10 Pia, by the way, and I'm the maths teacher at the moment, and that's the fight I'm having with him at the moment. So anyway, there's a fun fact. Secondly, as always, brilliant stuff presentation. Pia, always authoritative. It was incredible. One new term that I learned actually was this, and I hope I represent it right, or I understood it right, that isomorphic rulemaking as it relates to better rules, which leads me to my question about, like, who in the world, in your opinion, or based on what you know, is leading this globally? Like, are there rules, guidelines, policies that are being set to direct this better rules approach?
So, so no one's leading it. There's a bunch of scallywags like us trying to do it, right, wherever we can. The one thing that has been put into place properly, which is a huge step in the right direction, which I'm glad to say I had just the tiniest amount of influence in and support in, was so some folk from the European Union, I think, at some point came across Rules as Code a few years back and reached out and said, oh, this sounds interesting, talk to us more about it. And so I did, you know, I just shared and chatted and blah, blah, blah. And then they came back, and it was so interesting to see how they had, because I'd taken the time to really help them understand the opportunity, not just the concept, but the opportunity. They actually ran with it and went and built a new requirement that any new European Union regulations have to provide as part of their drafting process, a reference implementation in code. So that is actually part of the requirements for European Union regulations now, as of, I think, a year or two ago. How broadly known it is a different thing. I was trying to push for make that part of the consultation process, but they landed somewhere slightly softer, which was when you produce the regulation, you need to have a machine-readable. But even having to have a machine-readable reference implementation ahead of finalizing the regulation creates a greater requirement to an opportunity, therefore, to test prior to implementing. And it gives the opportunity for people looking at that regulation and assessing it to actually test it. And then to say, oh, why did you interpret it this way? Oh, have you thought about it this way? So that's a big win, and that's starting to drive a shift, which is good. The problem we have, the real barrier we have, is that the people responsible for writing the rules and how to do drafting are probably, in most governments, the least technically capable, because whether it's the parliamentary officers or officers of the parliament who set those rules. So New South Wales did, in their report a few years ago, say that drafting as in human and machine readable form would be necessary at some point and moving forward. So it was built into one of their reports, and it was one of the big recommendations they made. So that's a second sort of opportunity. But who has the authority? Arguably, parliamentary officers have the authority to make that happen, but they don't have the technical understanding, and they're very disempowered, and they're massively overworked, and they are very small and don't have a lot of support. So really, those are the officers that we need to support to build up their capability, very much so. And that's why people like Matthew Waddington, who I know Jason knows very well, are so important, because they're actual drafters working in actual parliamentary offices moving things forward. So the work that he's been doing in Jersey, is it, Jason? Yeah, is, you know, that is a parliamentary office taking those steps. So as more and more of those people who have the authority for the rules and process of legislative and regulatory drafting get on the bandwagon, it will just become normal at some point. But that's, you know, meanwhile, lots and lots of other organizations can adopt and can develop and can even build it into their own drafting processes. But we're not going to see it normalized until the people responsible for publishing rules and regulations make it part of the requirement, and until it gets built into those guidance and requirements as well. Martin.
Thank you.
Oh, no, you're welcome. Sorry. Martin, over to you. You've been waiting very patiently. Thank you.
Hey, Pia. Good to meet you. I am currently at the Canada School of Public Service doing rules as code. I joined after you had left the Government Canada, I think maybe a couple of months afterwards. Met Jason Morris there. We worked together for a good year and a half or so. My question is actually relating to drafters as well. So recently I've been working much more closer with drafters, like almost on a regular basis at this point. And I'll often come to them with rules that I'm convinced are prescriptive. And it's just like, this is clear cut. And they always find something to point to say, oh, actually, no, I don't know about this. I don't know about that. And, you know, for me, sometimes it's like, okay, come on, maybe a date calculation should be a little more, you know, mathematical and simplistic. And I think there are cases like that where we can argue, you know, this should just be a little simpler. But I also get, you know, there are certain cases where it's like, I can't understand the nuance. I can't understand why you don't want to commit to a particular interpretation. So my question to you is, how do we deal with situations like these, knowing that drafters are such important allies in the space for us? Like, how do we manage these types of scenarios? Like, what would you suggest?
So things that have worked for me in the past, which is probably the most useful to you, is first of all, gaming the rules. So saying, okay, you want to keep this kind of loose. So what if someone applied it this way? So we had a situation in New South Wales government where the drafters of a particular policy, it was actually, it ended up becoming the community gaming regulation. But what it basically was is regulation around gambling, right? And around, you know, what are the rules around a chook raffle versus the rules around, you know, a multi-million-dollar car giveaway kind of, you know, thing. Because of course money laundering happens, and they needed ways to make sure that that there was some controls and guardrails around these kinds of things, right? To make sure a bingo game didn't suddenly turn into an underworld criminal enterprise kind of thing, which can happen. So we started with hey, this seems like the perfect kind of test-driven approach, because these rules are rules that people need to first figure out whether their game needs to be regulated or not. You know, what are the rules of what a different game is? It seems like a perfect prescriptive rule. And they're like, oh, no, we've already done all the rules. Don't worry about it. And so we said to them, well, I'll tell you what, just as a little offer, how about we just do a 2-hour workshop and we just see if we can break your rules. You can use this as a test run. You know, don't see it as us changing your drafting process. You can just use this as a test. Let's just see if we can, you know, red, green, you know, red, what they call it, red, blue team, black hat, your rules, right? Oh, sorry, just 1 second, everyone.
Does everybody know what a chook raffle is? Maybe you should explain for international visitors. Chook is the Australian colloquial name for chicken. A chook raffle is like a school fundraising event, usually very small scale. Go for it, Pia.
Sorry. So sometimes it's just about being helpful. This sounds like a really great thing. Can we test it? Do you want to use this as a test thing? And they're only going to get benefit out of that, right? But what we did when we did that little workshop was we figured out 10 different ways that we could, as a regulated entity, interpret their rules in a way that was completely contradictory to the intention of their regulation. And that made them go, oh, well, if you can do it, then someone else can probably do it. So how could we strengthen these rules? And then, even though they'd already done a first draft of their rules, at that point, we engaged in, if you like, the test-driven improvements, iteration to the work they'd already done. And they'd done like really good work. We were just able to show that we could break it. A second strategy is just a little bit of modeling. I found, you know, things like the date, right, is a really interesting one. Do you want it from a minute past midnight or 11:59 p.m.? And people are like, but does that really matter? And so we'd show them the numbers. Well, for this particular benefit, that would affect 10,000 people. Is that 10,000 people that you think shouldn't get that extra day of support? And in a place like Canada, where there is a real, you know, how do we support people get their entitlements, as opposed to some of our other countries that are like, how do we minimize those entitlements? Like tapping into that intention of trying to help people live better, a little bit of modeling and a little bit of data to show, well, here's the impact if people made this interpretation of it versus this interpretation of it, can be very helpful. The other part is to say, So to just work with them around what do you want to be consistently applied? And particularly in Canada, in order to maintain equity, we don't want to create inequity by this rule being interpreted in these different ways, depending on whether you have enough money to pay someone to interpret it in the way that's beneficial to you. So how do we make sure that the consistency supports equity is a very helpful argument, right? And I think that in Canada that resonates quite well. And where do you genuinely want to have judgment? Because judgment is helpful as opposed to judgment creating inconsistency, which leads to inequity. So talking about from that perspective, you want to have judgment here, that's great. But if you allow too much ambiguity, it's going to create inequity, can be a very powerful argument. I hope that's helpful, Martin.
Oh, that is. Thank you very much. And good to meet you.
Yeah, really great to meet you too. I'm really, really excited to hear more about your work, maybe at another town hall sometime. That'd be amazing.
Hey, Pia.
Neil, sorry, just one last thing. Neil Bauer, have you come across Neil?
Oh, yes. I frequently chat with Neil. He's
Oh,
one who
good.
basically created the position, so I know him quite well.
Excellent. Well, please pass on hello for me, but he's definitely an amazing ally to have there.
Pia, there is another question in the chat, and I'm sure there are other questions that are that are on the tip of everybody's tongues. I've certainly got a couple. Are you okay for another question, or do you have to rush?
I have to go in a second, but I will answer this one. Con, it's a really interesting question, right? Because the confidentiality thing depends on the type of policy. So because in Australia, too many people interpret policy as just the advice to government, even in that process, what?
Martin just had to.
Oh, Martin. Okay, cool. Even in the advice to government process, rules as code can help with the modeling of the benefits to communicating to that person the potential impacts, right? So it can be sort of put forward as we want to help you understand the potential impacts of your proposal, of your policy suggestion, right? Of your policy intent. So from that perspective, it can still help with that. But of course, there's many forms of policy that have and in fact, all forms of policy at some point get consulted. Even if it's a direction from the minister, at some point it's going to come out. So whether it's early in the phase, just between a few select few rules as code to support better understanding of the impact, and so presenting it and framing it as a tool to help you get the best possible chance that your policy is going to have your intended impact, and it helps you mitigate the risk of policies creating unintended impact is good. But any form of ledger or reg has to go through a consultation process. All of them have to go through a consultation process. And even if that consultation process is the parliament, they all have to go through a consultation process. So feeding it in as part of look, if we create a reference implementation to be part of that consultation process, part of that engagement process, that gives a better chance of people being able to see how it should be interpreted, and gives us a chance to weed out some issues before it even goes out for consultation in order to minimize the risk that we've said something stupid. So again, rules as code, framing it as a risk mitigation in the policy development cycle in order to identify potential conflicts, identify potential unintended impacts or effects, and in order to better consult with people about the reality of how the policy might be implemented, rather than a fantasy land, can actually be very helpful. That would be my couple of recommendations there. Funnily enough, and it was working in Canada, like I was working in Canada when COVID happened, and of course people wanted to build new legislation and regulation for emergency benefits, and it was the first time anyone had realized, we don't like regulation and legislation. Well, it's not the first time people have realized, but legislation and regulation is one of the very few things in this world that goes from being one of the highest level of security in government, like cabinet and confidence, to them being unclassified, open source, the moment it passes Parliament, right? And a bit before. So it's one of those few pieces of content that actually shifts its classification from the most extreme to the least extreme in a moment, basically. But it meant that all of the tools to do the drafting, none of them were on the top secret network, because they'd done all their drafting so manually before. So it actually forced this shift to, well, why are those things being drafted in such a secretive, like it's actually only been because of the presumption of secrecy and confidentiality. But actually, if you open up the process a bit more, like we've seen in Taiwan, then there's a lot of opportunities to actually just get better policy outcomes and better policy drafting. And every politician, no matter how hell-bent they are on a particular concept, they just still want to know if it's going to embarrass them. So helping them identify early those risks or conflicts can be very helpful. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much. I hope that was useful and really appreciate being invited to come. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing, Pia. Thank you again for participating, presenting today at the Rules as Code Guild Town Hall. Our next Town Hall meeting, we're always the first Wednesday in the month, but we do change the time zones so that more people can participate. So next Rules as Code will be the 2nd of July, which is a Wednesday here. And yeah, we will announce on the website who the presenter will be at the next Rules as Code meeting. You will be able to find a recording of this on the website next to invitations to join the Slack channel, get involved in the conversation that is ongoing between these meetings. So please do come along and ask the questions that you had once you watch the recording of today's Town Hall. Thanks again, Pia, for a fantastic run through so much of the Rules as Code world, and there's lots more to explore. We look forward to seeing everybody the first Wednesday of July. Take care. Bye-bye.